It's 1937 in Beijing, China. It's a freezing winter morning, and the mutilated body of a young 19-year-old foreign girl lays in a ditch after a brutal murder. Shortly after, war breaks loose and a Japanese invasion interrupts the progress of the investigation, and so, to this day, the case remains unsolved. Rumours of sex trafficking, eccentric expats, nudist colonies, booze, drugs, gambling, and rumours of botched assassinations are featured in this unusual case. Hey, I'm Carl. Today's investigation is about the unusual murder of Pamela Werner. Now, just quickly before I get stuck in, I will be posting videos regularly of true crime story investigations. If this sounds like it would interest you, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. Now, enough delay, let's head back to the 1930s. Our story today begins in 1930s Beijing, China, a place very different to the city we know today. In this period, Beijing was in the new era of the Republic of China, fresh from the ruins of the Qing dynasty. For many centuries, China had been basically a closed society, suspicious of foreigners, but during this period, an influx of outsiders had arrived. Included in these arrivals was a fairly colourful and diverse foreign community. Many were stranded travellers. Lots were from a growing number of white Russian political refugees fleeing Stalin and the Russian Civil War. Some were fugitives fleeing their homelands, and many were wealthy foreign business people. Amongst this particular subset was a man called Edward Werner, a British citizen born in New Zealand who had the luxury of travelling the world with his family thanks to his wealthy dad. When Edward was old enough, he enrolled in the English Foreign Officers Cadet program and was sent to Beijing to learn Chinese, and would go on to become a keen student of Chinese culture. While living in Beijing, he eventually met his wife, a woman by the name of Gladys, who was part of the Beijing foreign social elite of the time and daughter of a retired British Army colonel. The new couple continued their lives in China, and by 1918 they came to an agreement to make a giant leap, a big decision. They chose to expand their family and adopt an infant child. Edward and Gladys inquired at a local orphanage in Beijing and would end up adopting a 2-year-old girl and decided on a name. She would now be known as Pamela. Now, taking into consideration the political climate of the time, it is speculated that young Pamela was the descendant of exiled Russian Caucasians who fled after the 1917 revolution. But storied history aside now, a young infant Pamela had a new place to call home with her new mum and dad in a residence located outside the city's heavily exclusive legation quarter. A place populated with many other foreign locals. For the next 3 years, the Werners would continue living their lives in Beijing and go about their business like any other regular locals. But sadly, the journey of this new family would reach its end after having barely begun. In 1921, Gladys fell ill with a case of meningitis, and while she was being treated with drugs, she tragically died from an overdose. So the situation was this. Now, as a single parent in his late 50s and having to take care of a very young 5-year-old daughter, Edward had very little time to grieve and would end up devoting a significant amount of time to Pamela, teaching her Chinese to the point where she was extremely fluent. She eventually became known for being a very articulate girl. She was also known as an adventurous person, and she emulated her dad by getting stuck into vast amounts of recreational bicycle adventuring around the city. However, in contrast to her adventurous side, personality-wise, Pamela had been described as being shy and reserved. Down the track, Edward enrolled Pamela in an exclusive school in Tianjin. Interestingly, despite Pamela growing up in Beijing, Edward actually wanted to send Pamela to his home country of England. Apparently, there was an incident with a man who was headmaster of the school. He allegedly made sexual overtures to her. To make matters worse, Edward also wasn't pleased about some of the attention she was getting from her male classmates. There was even a story where Edward was so aggravated that he attacked a boy with a stick. This little side note tidbit will become a little bit more important later on. Moving along now. On the 8th of January 1937, Pamela, who is now 19, attended a dental appointment before returning home to compose a few letters. After she finished up that task, she planned to leave home in the late afternoon. The house servant, a man named Ho, usually left around this time to purchase food for the house and asked Pamela if she would like him to get her anything while he's out for groceries. She declined though, mentioning to him that she herself would be going out shortly anyway. She mentioned that she would be back in time for dinner at around 7:30 and asked Ho if he could prepare some meatballs and rice. Afterwards, Pamela left the house on her bicycle. Pamela met up with one of her friends, a girl named Ethel, a daughter of Russian defectors and someone who she had known for years. The girls rendezvoused at the famous Wagons Litz Hotel, which was frequented by the city's wealthy foreign community. Afterwards, they went back to Ethel's place, where her mother gave them some tea and cake. Apparently, Pamela didn't eat much because she said she wasn't feeling very hungry. Perhaps she was considering the fact that dinner was waiting for her at home. Afterwards, at about 6 p.m, the two friends then visited an ice skating rink and were joined by another friend called Lillian, another Russian immigrant. The girls would continue to have fun skating and talking and just generally enjoying each other's company until approximately 7:30, when Pamela said she had to leave for dinner. Now, her friends must have been worried about her and asked if she was comfortable travelling home alone at night. She explained to them that she always travels alone and that, direct quote, "Nothing can happen to me here in Peking." Lillian watched Pamela cycle away with her skates draped over her shoulder. This would be the last time anyone is known to have seen Pamela alive. At 8 p.m, Pamela's dad Edward had arrived home. Time rolled on, and by 10:30 he must have been getting concerned, so he asked Ho to go out and check the ice rink to see if Pamela is there. When Ho arrives, the rink had closed and the workers were doing their cleaning and setting up duties for the evening. But most importantly, they weren't able to provide him with any specific information due to the sheer volume of people that had attended the rink that night. When Ho returned with no information, Edward decided to venture out by himself with an electric torch to look for his daughter. So, taking a step back for a moment, when investigating this story, there does seem to be some conflict between sources over if Edward returned home at 1 a.m. and went to bed, or if he spent all night looking for her, or even if he went searching at all. This fact remains uncertain, it seems. It's early the next morning, and sometime not long after 8 a.m, a couple of rickshaw drivers noticed by the city's old walls a group of wild dogs showing curiosity to an obscure bundle sitting in a ditch next to the wall. An older man nearby also notices and approaches to have a closer inspection. What he finds is the severely beaten and stabbed body of a Caucasian girl. The man raced off to the nearest police station about 400 meters away and reported his disturbing discovery. When police arrived onto the scene, they quickly roped off the area, covering the body in bamboo to prevent unwanted attention from passers-by. Back at home, Werner had returned to his search. One of the first things he did that morning was leave a note concerning Pamela's disappearance at the police commissioner's office. When Werner continued on not too long after, while walking, he noticed a roped-off crime scene in the distance. When he realised there was a body there, he cried out Pamela's name and fell to the ground in despair next to her body. He had seemingly recognised the clothing and jewellery as belonging to Pamela. Initially, the police suspected that it was simply a case of suicide, apparently not unusual for Russian whites at the time, considering their tumultuous and difficult circumstances. However, it was quickly recognised that the extent of the injuries points more towards a violent murder, and that's what we are going to delve into right now. Pamela's body was of course taken in for an autopsy. The report revealed that the time of death was estimated to have been between 10 p.m. to 2 a.m, but most revealingly she had died from a brain hemorrhage caused by several blows to the skull, possibly with something solid like wood or stone. Her body was so badly mutilated in certain areas that it couldn't be proven if a sexual assault had taken place. In saying that, Pamela's skirt was loose, Her stocking had been torn, and her underwear was missing, and also her heart was taken from her body. Still on her body was an expensive wristwatch, possibly proving further that she wasn't a target of a thief. It was also suggested that whoever killed Pamela was either an expert with a knife or had a great idea about human anatomy. Curiously, the report also found that her body contained half-digested Chinese food, which is interesting to note considering the last known food she ate, of course, consisted of cake and tea at her friend Ethel's place. So, in the initial days following the murder, a bunch of leads began to trickle in. Most of them not helpful. But there were a few with a bit more substance. In retracing Pamela's steps of the afternoon and night of the 7th of January, the detectives did learn one new piece of information. Between 3 and 4 p.m, she had gone to the concierge at the Wagons Litz and asked about renting a room, going so far as to check out the hotel's brochure. Why she did this was not known. It has been speculated that she could have been organising a meet-up with a boy from her class at her old school, whom she had shown interest in, or perhaps she was planning to leave her dad's home long term. Further along, attention was being given to a local rickshaw driver who was spotted soaking out blood from a cushion cover not far from the crime scene. This man's actions caused enough suspicion that he was taken in for further questioning. But nothing much really ended up coming from this. This next lead is where things start getting a bit weird. A man simply known as Pinfold was taken in for questioning and was one of the first suspects. Pinfold was part of the lower socio-economic part of the foreign community in Beijing. This man had a colourful past. Apparently he was originally a deserter from the Canadian Army who fled to the US only to gain a criminal record there. So he escaped to China. Unsurprisingly, he got tangled up with the local crime scene and became involved with criminal organisations and related societies around Beijing. The reason why he was brought in for further investigation was because an officer noticed him milling about suspiciously near the crime scene longer than most of the other civilians and passers-by. When the officer approached Pinfold, it was quickly noticed that he had a bloodstain on his shirt, and later, his landlady found a knife with blood on it in his home. During the investigations and questioning, it became clear that Pinfold wasn't going to say anything. Apparently he seemed very fidgety and nervous. However, this likely could have been attributed to withdrawal symptoms from opiate addictions, an increasingly common issue amongst that segment of society at the time. Pinfold was held overnight, but never did say where the blood on his clothes or his knife came from. That isn't all though. One of Pinfold's acquaintances was a man called Wentworth Prentice, an American Harvard graduate dentist who had some quite colourful recreational habits. Most notable was the fact that he ran a nudist colony in the hills aimed mainly at wealthy elites such as diplomats. It was said Prentice would pay girls to party and dance naked at his apartment. Prentice was not some young bachelor either. He also had a wife and children who left to return to the US about 5 years earlier. It was also revealed by the US consulate that there was a registered complaint about him, and there were concerns for the safety of Prentice's daughter, but it was never actually specified why. When Prentice was questioned about the murder, he denied having met Pamela, and he was in fact at the cinema during the night of the murder. Now, if the police had put this piece of information to Pamela's dad Werner, they would have realised, as far as the claim of having never met her wasn't true, as Werner had proof in the form of a note that Pamela had actually had an appointment with Prentice in December of 1936 for teeth straightening. Now, of course, a dentist meets loads of clients in a short amount of time, and it's fair enough that he might have forgotten, but it's an interesting note. Now, Werner was certainly suspicious of this man Wentworth Prentice. Edward believed that Prentice invited Pamela to a party, got her drunk, tried to make an advance on her, and murdered her when she resisted. Unsurprisingly, with many criminal cases, people questioned the family first, so Werner himself was mentioned as a possible suspect. Apparently, members of the foreign expat community were suspicious of him. They pointed to occasional incidents of Werner having a short temper. Werner was absolutely fixated on Pamela's case and determined to investigate and solve the murder, and outside of these suspicions from outsiders, there is nothing concrete that really suggests involvement from Werner. Werner, though, was frustrated by the work and effort of the investigators. For him, it wasn't enough. So he pulled up his sleeves and began interviewing people himself. Investigating his daughter's murder became an obsession, and if he couldn't investigate something himself, he would hire Chinese agents to assist. This would last for many years. One person Werner talked to was a lead who he claims was largely ignored and discounted by investigators. This person was a 19-year-old rickshaw coolie who had been working the local streets on the night of Pamela's murder, and what he had to say was very alarming. The young man claimed that he noticed a small group of foreign men walk into a well-known nearby brothel with an injured yet still alive young woman. After a few hours had passed, the men came out with the woman, barely conscious, and got the young man to load her into the rickshaw to transport her only a short distance towards the foot of the wall where Pamela's body was found the following morning. The rickshaw driver got out of there promptly and did not see what happened to the woman. Perhaps one of the more peculiar theories was that of a botched assassination attempt. Helen Foster Snow, a notable American journalist known for writing about the Chinese Civil War, and also one of the Werner family's neighbours, told the detective that it might have been possible that government Kuomintang assassins had mistaken Pamela for her, since the two looked similar. She knew that the Chiang government had not been happy with the things she and her husband Edgar had said about them, especially in contrast with their sympathetic portrayal of their political rivals. Moving along. Another theory, this one a little bit more concrete. This one is quite popular and it alleges that Pamela was murdered by a Chinese student by the name of Han Xiaoxing. Apparently, Han and Pamela were school friends, and Han had taken an interest in her. Now, remember how I mentioned earlier on that Edward chased a boy with a stick? Well, that boy was Han. Edward claimed that on one occasion he broke Han's nose and chased him with a stick because he didn't like him hanging around, and apparently he was one of many local boys waiting at the school gate enticing the girls to go with them to tea, cinemas, or even to their rooms. It isn't well established what Pamela's feelings were towards Han. In any case, due to the severity and mutilation involved in the murder of Pamela, revenge might be the case, and that would suggest that she was perhaps murdered by someone who knew her well, in which case Han might fit that bill. Perhaps the biggest suspicion worth mentioning about is that Han was nowhere to be found at the time when the police went looking for him. The British Chief Inspector of the time was convinced Han was the murderer. Despite abundant media attention, the whole case would be quickly forgotten about. Less than 6 months into the investigation, the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred just outside Beijing, kicking off the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Battle of Beijing-Tianjin would ensue, and the city of Beijing was now covered in war and turmoil. Beijing had bigger problems. Only about a month later, Beijing was now in the control and governance of Imperial Japan. Han Shu, the boy who was mentioned previously as a possible major suspect, was reportedly killed by Japanese military police during their occupation, bringing that line of query to an end. So, with the investigation now interrupted by war, what happened after? What happened to Werner and the investigation? Let's find out. In March of 1943, the few Europeans that remained in Beijing were eventually rounded up by the occupying Japanese military and marched off into crowded trains for a 600-kilometre-long journey to the Huaxin internment camp in Shandong, where they spent the remainder of the war. Edward Werner was amongst them. Also, Wentworth Prentice. According to other survivors, apparently Werner confronted Prentice on multiple occasions regarding Pamela's murder in a few volatile exchanges. After the war, Edward Werner returned to Beijing and continued to investigate his daughter's cruel murder. He would eventually return to Britain, a country he had not visited since 1917, and outlived pretty much everyone associated with the case. When Werner died at age 89, there was apparently nobody left who knew him to attend his brief funeral service. As for his victim daughter Pamela, she is buried deep somewhere beneath what is today's Beijing 2nd Ring Road. So many possibilities in this case to think about. I'm actually surprised that this case doesn't get more attention. But that's all I have for today. If you found this story interesting at all, or if you're really interested in true crime investigations and stories, please again consider subscribing, or if not, please like the video. Anyway, thanks for your time. Catch you next time.